Hello and welcome to the Hardy Woods podcast. I'm your host, Colin Fraser. A lot of what we've talked about on this show so far has been around the importance of early successional habitat in young forests for wildlife, especially when we're talking about birds. And sometimes when we talk about habitat, it seems like game birds like turkeys and grouse take up a lot of the oxygen in the room. But on today's show, we're going to dive deep into the world of a little bird that's very important you might not have heard of, the golden-winged warbler. Our guest is Amanda Duren, Director of Conservation Partnerships at the American Bird Conservancy. Amanda Duren has been with the American Bird Conservancy and the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture since 2015, first as the Pennsylvania Cerulean Warbler Appalachian Forest Enhancement Partnership Coordinator, before becoming Habitat Delivery Coordinator in 2018, and Director of Conservation Partnerships in 2021. Suffice to say, Amanda knows a tremendous amount about these birds, their habitat, and we're thrilled to have her here today. Amanda, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Colin. Really excited to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about the Bird Conservancy?
Sure. As you said, I work for American Bird Conservancy, which is a nonprofit. We are actually just celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, and we are focused on bird conservation across the Americas. And I, in my position, I work for the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture, and that organization, we are housed under American Bird Conservancy, but we are a separate partnership organization. We're a regional partnership of more than 50 state and federal agencies, conservation organizations, and universities. We're also a bird conservation organization. We're focused on improving habitat in the Appalachians for the benefit of birds, other wildlife, and people.
That's great. I know from what I've read about the American Bird Conservancy's work, threatened birds are near the top of the priority list, and golden-winged warblers are listed as near threatened. So that's what we're talking about today. I looked up the Latin name, which is Vermivora chrysoptera, which, as far as I can tell, means golden-winged worm eater. Amanda, what can you tell us about this little guy?
Yeah, golden-winged warblers are a beautiful little bird if you get a chance to get your eyes on them, but they have unfortunately experienced some pretty significant declines. And in my work as the Director of Conservation Partnerships with the joint venture, we are focused on making sure that birds in the Appalachians have the habitat that they need in the right places to be successful in nesting and raising young. There's more than 200 species of birds that regularly occur within the Appalachian region, but some of those are species that we've identified as a high priority for our work, and that can be either because of steep declines or because of a high regional responsibility, meaning that within the Appalachians we have a high portion of that species' overall population. And for golden-winged warbler, they are experiencing one of the steepest declines of any songbird actually within the U.S. And they have been declining at a rate of more than 2.5% a year, which is a 66% decline overall since about the late 60s. And even within the Appalachian regions, actually, that decline is even more significant. So it's really important for us at the joint venture to be thinking about this species and what it needs, and to make sure that it has the habitat within the Appalachians that it needs to be able to nest successfully and ultimately try to reverse those declines that we're seeing. But the bird itself, it's a migratory species, which means that it's only actually with us here in the Appalachians for a small portion of the year. You can try and catch a glimpse of these guys sometime between late April, early May through the end of August and early September. And outside of those times, they are actually making these amazing journeys from here in the eastern U.S. or in the Great Lakes region, south through Central America and South America, where they're actually spending the winter months. And these birds, they're beautiful, which it makes it even harder when it's you're trying to get your eyes on them in some of the habitat that they're in, and it can be a challenge sometimes to actually get your binoculars on these birds. But they are a species where the males and females have a different appearance. The males are, as with many other species of birds, kind of the flashier of the two. They are the ones with the golden patches that help them get their name, both golden on their wings as well as on the crown of their head. They have this beautiful black throat and an eye mask that has a white stripe around it. And the females are sort of a more muted version of that color pattern, more of a greenish yellow of those wing patches and on the crown, and then the throat and their eye mask is more of a gray than that stark black. But they're both really beautiful. And something to point out, I think, that people don't realize, especially when you don't get to necessarily have these birds in your hand, is that they're very small. They are only about 5 inches long, and they weigh about as much as one AAA battery. So to think that those little birds are able to get the resources they need to have enough energy to make it from here down to Central and South America and then return back every year is pretty amazing.
That's not what people probably think about all the time when they think about migratory birds. I mean, people are used to thinking about, Canada geese flying in a V. It seems a little bit more feasible, but those little guys flying over the Gulf, it really is remarkable.
Yeah, it is. And a lot of people don't realize that they're making that journey almost entirely at night. So we do see things like hawks and geese flying during the day, and I think some people assume that that's when most birds are making their journeys, but a lot of, especially these warblers, are flying primarily at nighttime. So when you see them during the day, during the migration period, they are coming down to be able to rest up and refuel their energy reserves so that they can continue that journey.
Mm-hmm. Now, we were talking about the population declines, and those are incredibly steep. And a lot of times when we talk about this sort of thing, it's that kind of steep population decline is almost always related to habitat loss. Is that the case here?
Yes, generally. It's believed that the loss of habitat, particularly in the breeding range, but also perhaps in their wintering grounds as well. And it's not necessarily the loss of forest cover from the landscape, but most likely the loss of the young forest that these birds rely on. So generally, since the time in the 1800s and early 1900s, when there was wide-scale clearing of most eastern forests, then the forest started regrowing from that. And during that period, we had a lot more young forest on the ground. And since then, as forests have been allowed to continue to mature generally, and we've seen declines in things like timber harvesting, as well as in fire on the landscape, that has led to an overall increase in the age of forests on the landscape. And so species like golden wings that rely on young forests have seen a lot of significant population declines for that reason. But there are other factors that have been cited as some of the reasons for the decline of golden wing. They don't just need young forests, they also need to have young forests in a very largely forested landscape. So as contiguous forest is lost, meaning that some areas of forest are being fragmented by agriculture and urban development, that can cause declines as well. And then hybridization from a very closely related species called the blue-winged warbler has also led to some of the declines in the species.
Well, I think the hybridization question is really interesting, and I want to get to that in a minute, but what is it about a golden wing warbler's life and needs that make it, I think the right word is obligate to that early successional growth? Like, what's happening in those communities that the warblers rely on?
So the habitat that they are relying on, that young forest habitat, is during that period of time in the season where they are actively nesting and raising their young before they leave the nest. And that young forest habitat is really important for them in providing the cover that they need for nesting, so that they are a ground nesting species, and they will nest usually at the base of a plant like goldenrod or blackberry that has a kind of a solid stem for them to build against. But it's an open nest that they make out of leaves, grapevine bark, long strips of grass. So those are all herbaceous plants that they are finding in these young forested shrubby habitats. And then in addition to that, they are able to find the food resources, generally caterpillars, that they need to feed their young in these young forest habitats. The dense plant growth tends to provide the caterpillar and insect biomass that they need to be able to raise their young. And it's another misconception. I think a lot of people don't understand just how much birds rely on insects. I think many people think that they can eat seeds and go to their bird feeders throughout the season, but most birds, including golden-winged warblers, need the protein of insects to be able to raise their young successfully. And there's a study that came out showing that one nest of black-capped chickadees needs more than 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch of young. So it's a significant need. And these young forest habitats are where the golden-winged warbler is able to find those caterpillars and other insects that they need to feed their young.
So that ties back into pollinator habitat as well then, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Caterpillars become butterflies, then those are all in the same ecosystem.
Yes, exactly.
So when we look at these really steep population declines, and looking at the loss of these successional habitats, I think it's worth noting that we've made really big progress for birds before, like all the way back to 1918, right, with the Migratory Bird Act, which I think was largely for ducks and geese. But if you look at what we've done for raptors, but these smaller, ground nesting birds and that thrive in these shrubby habitats don't always seem to get the same urgency, at least in the public eye. Why do you think that is?
I think that it's because bird conservation is really complex, especially for a species like golden-winged warbler that has these kind of unique habitat needs. And the scale of which I don't think it's easy for some people to comprehend just how much of this young forest habitat we've lost on the landscape. And it's complicated, not to take away from any of the amazing conservation achievements that have happened for species like those that were affected by DDT, but it can sometimes be more complicated to address species declines like golden-winged warbler that have multiple sources, like habitats on the breeding ground, habitats on the wintering grounds, habitat issues during migration, having that stopover habitat that they need, and the complexity of the habitat needs for golden-wing especially. They don't just need young forest, they also need adjacent mature forest that they, as the young leave the nest, they actually bring those young birds into older forests. So it's really important that the golden-wing habitat, if it's going to be high quality, it has to be young forest, but within a matrix of structurally diverse and age class diverse forests. So it's complicated, and I think that's why it's been such a challenge to address some of these declines, not just in golden-wing, but in lots of different migratory species.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And looking at that different age class that they rely on, we have the importance of disturbance, successional growth. Our last episode was all about the decline of fire in the eastern woods. So it seems like there's part of this discussion is going to be about larger forest management to help create golden-wing habitat and other bird habitats. And when I've talked to other bird experts, it seems like there are better and worse forest management decisions that people can make. Is that something you'd like to speak to about just forest management decisions and what would help these birds?
Sure, absolutely. Forest management and sustainably managed forests are one of the most valuable tools we have in the toolbox for creating golden wing warbler habitat. They generally are found in, these early successional young forests that are, if they are created through a timber harvest, it's generally less than a 20-year time frame that they are able to be using that habitat. There are other places that we find golden wing warblers where they can remain on the landscape for longer periods of time, like some forested wetlands, for instance, where the water conditions tend to maintain some of that young forest habitat. But generally speaking, timber harvesting and sustainable forest management are one of the best methods we have available to us to try to create this young forest habitat. And when you're thinking about how to manage forests to benefit golden wing warblers, you really have to think about that management at two different scales. You have to look at the landscape, the broader landscape where that site is, to make sure that it's going to be providing the necessary conditions for golden wings before you start thinking about what you can do at the actual site level. So within the landscape, I already mentioned that it's important for golden wings to be within an area that has a lot of forest. Generally, we're looking to focus in areas that have more than 70% deciduous forest cover within 1.5 miles of the site. So these are heavily forested landscapes that these birds are found in. And something that's really important, especially as these populations continue to decline, is that we need to focus our work in areas where there are already golden wing warblers present. And there are great conservation collaboratives like the Golden Wing Warbler Working Group that have helped to identify these places. So they've identified golden wing warbler focal areas for the states across the Appalachians where this work is most likely to be successful in attracting and creating high quality habitat for golden wing warblers. But generally, we're looking to work in places that are less than 5 miles and ideally less than 1 mile from known breeding populations and from other young forest patches of habitat. So it's important to think about where these birds already are on the landscape and make sure that we're targeting working in places close to those areas. And in addition to having a high percentage of forest cover within the landscape, it's also really important to focus in areas that have lower amounts of agriculture and urban cover in the landscape, because those two types of cover are not only areas where there tend to be more blue-winged warblers. I mentioned the potential to hybridize with that species, but also those types of land uses tend to make nesting golden wing warblers less successful. They tend to not be able to raise their young as successfully when those types of land cover are more common. But then as we start to think about what to do at the actual site level, you have to think about how to create this complex mosaic of habitats that golden wings need. Forest edge is really important. They often create their nests along the edge between the young forest and the more mature forest. So practices like edge feathering and thinking about the size and shape of the harvest that we're doing in order to create more edge habitat. So thinking about perhaps making a longer and more linear forest patch as opposed to a circular harvest can help create more of that edge, more of a meandering edge that can help increase the amount of nesting opportunities that the golden wings are going to have in that area.
So when we're talking about ideal golden wing warbler habitat, does elevation play a role?
It does. Golden wing warblers are generally found at elevations between 1,000 and 1,800 feet above sea level in the Appalachians, especially the northern Appalachians. And that is, again, a bit of a way to help distinguish golden wings from blue-winged warblers. Blue wings tend to be more at lower elevations. And so the populations that we find at higher elevations tend to be more genetically pure of the golden wings. And some of those high elevation places, especially in the southern apps, are the only places where golden wings are still found. So elevation can be key, and thinking about concentrating our work in some of those higher elevation forest patches that remain can help increase the chances that those are going to be used by golden wings.
So that gets us to what we keep kind of referencing about is the hybridization threat, and I think that's really interesting as a conservation threat. Can you explain that? Because I was really surprised to learn that these are that was such a big question for golden winged warblers going forward.
Absolutely. Blue-winged warblers are another species of conservation concern. So I certainly don't want to paint them as the enemy here. They are another really important species that also relies on young forest, but they are very closely related to golden winged warblers. And the two species can actually interbreed and produce fertile hybrid offspring, which is pretty cool when you think about it. The most recent genetic mapping of the species has shown that they're 99.97% alike, and that the species have probably been intermixing for thousands of years. So this narrative that they are encroaching and only recently intermixing is believed to not actually be the case, that these species have been intermixing for a really long time. But some of the conditions, especially related to agricultural development as well as urban development, that has made it possible for blue wings to kind of expand into areas where it would have been historically more dominated by golden wings, has led to some more of this hybridization. But there's actually two different forms of the hybrid. They're called Brewster's warblers or Lawrence's warblers, and they had previously been believed to be two separate species, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. And if you think back to like your high school genetics class, biology class of dominant and recessive traits, that's actually how the different colorations play out on these hybrid offspring. So there's,
Mendel
for
squares,
instance,
right?
exactly, yeah. When you think about throat color, for instance, the dominant trait, the dominant gene is to have a non-black throat. So that would be the blue-winged and Brewsters are the two that have that non-black throat. And the recessive is the black throat. So if the hybrid receives two recessive genes, then it'll end up being a Lawrence's warbler with the black throat. And if it receives a dominant and a recessive, then it'll be a Brewster's without a black throat. So it's pretty interesting to be able to have a kind of real world example of those genetics crosses, those squares, Punnett squares you used to do in biology class. But yeah, it's fascinating. And it's kind of complicating for biologists sometimes, because in the places where these species both occur and where they hybridize, it can be really challenging to survey for these species with any certainty, because they all can sing very similar songs. The hybrid species will sing the songs of their parents, and that could be either a golden wing or a blue winged. And so it is very complicated when we are doing things like using technology like autonomous recording units to survey these species. So we only have a recording of the bird and we don't actually get to see it. It's hard to do more than just say that this is a vermivora species. We don't know which one it is. So it's a bit of a complicating factor for biologists out there that are trying to study these species.
Right, and it's preserving a golden winged warbler is definitely a habitat first at that point, because if you not only have to have the specific habitat at a specific elevation in a specific location, it also has to be not near its cousins. So that is a really specific conservation question that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. It adds another compounding factor into why I say that bird conservation is so complex, especially for this species.
No kidding. So, I mean, I know that you guys have done a lot of work with the JV and the Bird Conservancy. Do you have any projects like in particular that you would want to highlight as this kind of habitat work?
I wanted to highlight not a specific project, but a specific program, because it has been so incredibly valuable for management for golden winged warblers. And that is the program called Working Lands for Wildlife through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. And although our public forests in the Appalachians play a really valuable role in offering forest habitat and even young forest habitat. Most of the golden-winged warbler's nesting habitat actually falls on private lands. More than 80% of the forests in the Appalachia are privately owned. So private landowners have a huge role to play in the conservation of this species. And the NRCS Working Lands for Wildlife program is a funding program that offers both financial and technical assistance to landowners who are interested in managing their property to benefit golden-winged warblers and other young forest species. And so AMJV and the American Bird Conservancy have been partners in the Working Lands for Wildlife program since it began back in 2012. And we have helped private landowners connect with those programs. And ultimately, the program has helped to improve habitat for golden wing on tens of thousands of acres across Appalachia. In particular, we've worked in West Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania on the program. But it helps landowners to understand what role they could play in creating habitat for golden-winged warblers, especially if they meet some of those characteristics that we mentioned of having other patches of young forest nearby or having golden-winged warblers on the landscape within a mile or even up to 5 miles. So it's just been instrumental in being able to connect with landowners who are interested, and maybe their interest lies elsewhere. Maybe they're interested in creating great habitat for rabbits or habitat for deer. So it helps align some landowner objectives that may be a little bit different with that for creating habitat for golden-winged warblers. So it's a wonderful program that still continues today. So it's an opportunity for anyone listening that's interested in learning about how they might be able to manage their forests for golden-winged warblers to be able to connect with NRCS on that program.
Well, that's really helpful. And I think in an earlier conversation, you mentioned citizen monitoring projects. Is that something that people should know about if they want to get involved in this project?
Absolutely. There are a number of excellent citizen science monitoring projects. And when I say citizen science, I mean that it's an opportunity for just regular folks who have an interest in birds to be able to collect data and information about birds that they are seeing and hearing around them and contribute that to a data set that scientists are able to rely on to learn about where species like golden-winged warblers are occurring, and to be able to track even things like new populations emerging, or to be able to track some expansion or declines that we might be seeing. You can't talk about citizen science and birds without talking about eBird. That is an amazing program where you can download an app on your phone and do a checklist, which is essentially just when you go out for a walk in the woods or even sit on your back patio and you're listening, you can submit reports of the birds that you're hearing. And so many people have contributed to this data set that it is gotten to the point where it is really valuable to researchers and biologists that are trying to track trends in these populations. And in particular, it's been valuable for golden-winged warblers in understanding where the species occurs and the timing that it occurs during migration. So it can be really difficult to track these species as they move between where they're nesting and where they spend the winter. But in having such a large data set of people across the country submit information about where they're seeing and hearing golden-winged warblers, then we can start to build up more information about where the species is occurring. And that ultimately helps us know where we need to be focusing our work to conserve them.
Well, that's really helpful. Yeah. So contributing citizen science where you can and being a mindful forest manager when it comes time to make those decisions. And NRCS is always a good place to start. So I was going to ask you what the best practices were, but I think you gave them to us. Unless you've got any other anything else that you guys would like to plug from the Bird Conservancy or the joint venture.
Yeah, I'll just mention it was great to point out that folks can help with citizen science and submitting reports, but even if you're not a landowner, you don't own forest land, there are a lot of things you can do to help conserve birds. We've been talking about golden winged warblers as a migratory species, and sometimes it can feel like there's not much you can do to help those species that have such great journeys and cover such huge amounts of ground. But I was talking about how they migrate at night, and having lights on at night can really disrupt their ability to navigate effectively. So participating in lights out programs and turning off lights outside your house at night can help these species make that journey safely. But then once they make it to the area where they're spending the winter in Central and South America, they are generally utilizing open forests kind of similar to the habitats they'll use here in the US. But another land use that provides habitat for these species, golden wing and other migratory birds, is actually shade-grown coffee plantations. So generally the conventional way to grow coffee is to remove all of the trees and grow it in a full sun environment. But coffee can actually be grown effectively in a shade environment as well. So in those areas, they actually maintain the canopy trees and grow the coffee under the cover of those trees. And because those canopy trees are retained, it actually provides really good foraging habitat for golden wing warblers and other migratory birds. So if you're a coffee drinker, there are shade-grown coffee options, and then there are even bird-friendly certified coffee options, like through the Smithsonian, for example, where
So that's the winter range.
Exactly. Yep.
The winter range, yeah.
Yeah. So you can make purchases like that help support golden wing warbler habitat in the winter range without even ever leaving the U.S. So it's just something else that you can do. But other than that, I would just encourage folks that are interested in learning more about birds and conservation to connect with us through our website at amjv.org or American Bird Conservancy's website at abcbirds.org. We have a lot of really great webinars that are offered pretty frequently through ABC. So I'd encourage people that have just an interest in birds and want to learn more to check those out as well.
Well, thank you, Amanda. That's really helpful. And thank you so much for being here. I think it's really important for people who care about woods and wildlife sometimes to remember that there are so many species that rely on really specific habitats. And it's not just the game animals or the ones you pull your car over to watch, but the whole suite of native wildlife matters, especially if we're going to conserve what we've got left. The work that y'all doing is huge, and we're really just glad to have you on. Thanks for all your hard work.
Thanks, Colin. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our work today, and look forward to connecting with any landowners or folks that are interested in learning more about birds through AMJV or ABC. So thanks for your time.
Sounds good. Appreciate it.